Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. My name's Giles Kime. I'm the executive editor of Country Life, apologies. And I am delighted to welcome so many of you this afternoon to this Hamptons virtual roadshow, in which we'll be discussing making your country house a home. Many people watching today will be anticipating a move to somewhere new, and when they're there, they'll be facing the exciting prospect of creating their dream country home. And I'm really delighted to have with us today two people who come at this subject from a very different perspective. Hampton's very own head of country house sales, Joanna Cocking, and also Emma Sims-Hilditch, who is one of Britain's most best-known interior designers, famous for creating elegant family homes that combine the best of old and new. Very warm welcome to both of you. Thank you very much for joining us all this afternoon and coming along to share your wit and wisdom. I just want to start, Joanna, with a quick update on the market, because obviously there was a huge amount of activity last year, and it's my sense that it's very much carried over to this year as well.
Yes, very much so, I would say. If anything, I would say I'm afraid the pressures of this last lockdown has probably enhanced that demand even further.
And are there any particular areas that people are heading for?
Yes, I think the demand for just having some escape from an urban environment has continued unabated. I think as the weather's got nicer, places that have water, tranquility, probably a degree of seclusion. I think equally environmentally, people don't want to escape it entirely. They do ask for village connectivity, and they do like the idea of being part of another community outside of the one that they might perhaps enjoy in our more urban centres, including London.
And presumably the prospect of flexible working is changing the whole landscape as well.
Yes, completely. As a dynamic, it's frankly altered everybody's perception and the bridging, I suspect, between that urban house, which many are holding on to, but also the enjoyment of the flexibility of working part of that time away from the office space in a more country environment, which frankly is pretty welcome.
Now, Emma, you live in one of those areas where a lot of people seem to be heading towards, which is Bath. Tell us a bit about that part of the world, why you love it and why you think people might be heading there.
Thank you, Giles. And I would absolutely rave about Bath and generally the West Country. It is very lucky that Bath has pretty much everything you could possibly want for both the countryside and also access to kind of London. I mean, Bath is a historic city, obviously. There's some beautiful pictures of it. And you really have got everything. You're spoilt for choice in Bath. You've got everything you possibly need in terms of, great architecture, fantastic houses, with gardens, and within sort of 10 minutes walk, you can get out of town and you can be in the rolling hills of the South Cotswolds. So yeah, it is a stunning place to live, and I think the other great thing about it is that the schools are fantastic too, as I know well, because I have three children who we educated locally in Bath. So for me, it's a no-brainer. The West Country, you've got brilliant access to the West Country, Cornwall, Devon, Wales for walking, and then going up north, you can get on a train and be up in sort of Manchester or even further afield quite easily.
Now, onto the topic under discussion today. You have the advantage of having already created your own dream country home. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, John and I, basically, my husband and I decided when we first got married that we didn't want to live in London. We were very clear about that, and he was in the army at the time and decided that actually Salisbury Plain was a good, convenient location. So we kind of drew a map on a circle. We drew a circle on a map, and we got the Ordnance Survey map out and started to look at villages. And we found this beautiful village just outside Bath. And in those days, it was we were lucky enough to find a derelict property. That's less possible now. They're rarer and rarer to find, but we were lucky to find a derelict schoolhouse, which had been two cottages and a barn, which wasn't attached to it at the time. And so, yeah, we ended up with this lovely home, which started off at 1,500 square feet, and now through a process of continued gentle restoration, we've increased it. There's the barn, which we converted. It is grade 2 listed, and it's we're lucky that it has lots of wonderful character. But when we started off life, we didn't have the finances to buy a big house, so we bought something run down, and we bought something with opportunity. That's actually my office, my home, but this is the studio where I work, which is 10 minutes outside Bath, and another grade 2 listed property, which was a pub. First, it started life as a farm, and then it was turned into after a period of being a farm, it was turned into a public house on the main road from Bristol to London, and we bought it as a derelict series of buildings, and we did a conversion. So in my heart, I mean, I would never buy something that was already done up. I would always be looking for an opportunity to develop something in the way that I wanted it. For me, it's all about yes, being able to put a creative stamp on something, be able to work with a historic building and to make it work for modern day life. So yeah, we were very lucky to be able to do that with our own home. And I think that's what I would always advise people, really, if they've got the appetite for a little bit of building work, which I'm sure Joanna will agree is can be off-putting to people.
Joanna, what are the new generation of buyers? What are they looking for when they're finding a country house?
I think with the newer generation of buyers from London, certainly the younger families, I think they are actually ideally looking for something that's relatively turnkey. I think they like the idea of perhaps cosmetic touches, but not much more than that, because they're coming with small children. I think perhaps the more experienced or those with slightly older children are really happy to take on projects. And that's where these lovely older houses do get their, as Emma says, makeovers. And I also think that although there's this expediency of buying something quickly to allow you to enjoy life straight away in the country, which I think, frankly, in the current climate, everybody's very keen to do, I do also think I do try to encourage to say to buyers, just think longer term. This is somewhere you're going to enjoy for many, many years to come. So it is sometimes worth just taking on a little bit of effort to get that right and create the ideal and perfect indeed country house.
Now, we've touched a bit on home offices because obviously those are more and more important. Emma, what's your advice to anybody planning to create a proper functioning office at home?
I think I'd sort of almost take an approach of making sure that you find a space in the house or outside the house which you can close, you can leave, you can actually have this work-life balance. I think I'm definitely have first-hand experience of when my office was at home. I I used to tend to stay in there too long, and my husband would threaten to put a key on the door and lock it so I could leave at 6 o'clock in the evening rather than stay in there till 7 or 8. I think you have to be careful that the office doesn't infringe on your daily life, and you need to remember the family. You need to remember, that if you're working from home, you almost need to have sort of rules that basically make sure that the work-life balance is there. So delineation of the spaces is really important. If you have got the luxury of a lovely outbuilding like that one, we work on lots of properties where it might have a small outbuilding that we can convert. And I think doing that's great. You need to just make sure that that space is beautiful because you're going to spend a lot of time there. So having good light, investing in the interior, making it comfortable, making it well planned, making sure you've got good Wi-Fi, obviously. And then thinking about things like, tea and coffee, having a nice little coffee machine, having things around you that make you happy. So perhaps beautiful art or some books. I think just decorate it nicely and think of it as an important space in the house rather than just a work office, which is, not what it has to be if it's a home office.
Joanna, you are in the enviable position of spending your professional life looking around some very, very beautiful houses that you're marketing. What has that taught you about kitchens in particular?
Kitchens probably are the most important part of the discussion when people are looking at houses. I suppose this life we all now lead, they are the hub of the home. I think the subtle changes I've seen recently, I think we went from periods where everybody wanted very, very big, very open plan spaces. I would say the changes in the last year with, dare I say it, homeschooling, working from home, and just having more flexibility around where you spend time in the house. I have seen greater choice over annexed rooms to kitchens. So whilst obviously the centrality of a nice big island like this one, easy open access to outside space is quite important, particularly with the recommendation on ventilation at the moment. But I think ancillary playrooms or even ancillary children's spaces, I mean, this one's been beautifully divided on this house where they've just allowed the beams to suggest the divide rather than having it all completely open. And obviously the cooking area is pushed further slightly forward, but there's some just lovely areas that you can make the most of it. I mean, most of these images, which I think are Emma's, are beautiful furniture as opposed to just fitted kitchens. And I think that's definitely a trend we're seeing more of, that as people want to spend more time in these spaces, they don't want them to immediately scream fully fitted. They want beautiful lighting. They want lovely stone, wood as detail, and just as Emma actually, fun enough, was just talking about home offices, even lovely pieces of art and such like that, because the rooms are generally large enough to cope with obvious things like steam from cooking and things like that, particularly gas, which can go a bit further afield. But I think, yes, just generally they're the big impact areas. So therefore, when I'm advising clients when they're selling, where we do help invest with them in some home staging advice or getting the house ready for photography and market, we do put primary focus on that kitchen space.
Emma, one of the many things I admire about your work is that you create houses that aren't just beautiful, but also they are completely grounded in practicality. And I think part of that is that when you design kitchens, it's about more than just a kitchen space. It's about all the supplementary ancillary spaces behind them. Tell us a bit about how that's evolved and why you think it's important.
Well, I always say that great design can really improve people's lives, and I do really strongly believe that. I think that we're all so busy, we're all running around, we're so manic, we're so hectic with our lives now, and we've got families, we've got children, so we want to be able to make sure that everything has a home. And through great organisation, we can literally de-stress ourselves. So if we know that the children's sports clothes or gym kit or whatever they're going to need every day is going to be in one cupboard, and perhaps we divide the cupboards into three if you've got three children, and they actually put away their kit when they come home in the right place, then for me that's all improving our quality of life in our homes. So really the homes have got to be very functional and practical, and that sort of leads from the kitchen into obvious rooms like the boot room, the laundry room. We just really think about these spaces. We have particular love for designing these kind of rooms, and having a basket for each kid's trainers, for example. There's never that kind of fretful moment where no one knows where their stuff is when they need it. So for me, great design is actually practical design as well as aesthetically pleasing. That's our home, and a bookcase which we designed because we needed some space for books. As you can see, we've got quite a lot of books in our life. And I came up with this idea that we had this sort of wall which divided the upstairs barn. Behind that wall is our bedroom, and there's a glass sort of triangle at the top there. And that just gave us a really kind of fun looking space. So So I think these, homes nowadays, as well as thinking about these utility spaces, taking a step back from that, it's important to look at the space planning first. And that's what we always do when we have a new project on our hands. We start with the space planning and we look to see how the house flows in its existing layout, and then how we can improve that flow. So for us, that's looking at maybe where the kitchen is. And I'm sure Joanna will agree, in some of the older buildings that we work on, the historic buildings, or just sort of, unmodernized buildings, sometimes the kitchens were really small. Sometimes they were in the kind of middle of the house without many windows. So we look at how perhaps we can change the space planning at the beginning and even repurpose rooms. So perhaps changing the drawing room, which might be the best room in the house, but actually, has all the lovely south-facing windows. Would it be better to actually use that room as the kitchen? So I think, just opening up the ideas, looking at the house in a holistic way is really, really important at the beginning of a project.
Joanna, last summer was exceptional for all sorts of bad, but also some good reasons. In that we had a beautiful summer months, and people spent a lot more time outside, partly because they had to, and it created an opportunity to see people. And do you think that there will be a legacy of that? Do you think people are more interested in gardens now and outdoor spaces?
Definitely. I think in a northern hemisphere we've always been good gardeners, but I think we are learning how to embrace our outdoor spaces in much more of a, I suppose, additional rooms to use. So whilst I'm not a huge fan of patio heaters necessarily, I think people have just got hugely creative, partly because so many of our eateries are now embracing everything from elegant rugs to braziers to awnings, screened areas to keep the wind out. But I think on a purely practical way, I think it's made people think about their gardens much more. They've had time to be in their gardens so much more. And whilst in most traditional country houses, the gardens are always elegant, look at that lovely hooped area and lovely box. But I think the fact is that people have rethought out how they use their gardens. And rather than thinking about it maybe for just a couple of months of the year, these leisure spaces that clearly are part of the enjoyment, like swimming pools and tennis courts, those have suddenly become very, very popular and quite high up the list of demands. I think most people expect a house at a certain price point to come with what we generally call the toys, but actually they've become quite specific about either can I put a pool in, or is there space for a pool? And obviously this looks entirely enticing. Yes, to sort of the furniture that goes with it, the investment that goes with it. And I suppose I liken it to places like Australia, where I know a friend of mine down there told me she spends more on the barbecue they use outside on the actual cooker they use inside. I don't think we've quite got to that stage, but I do think people are thinking in very much more broader sense of how many more months can I extend being outside? Because I think, as I say, partly the climate, but partly the time we've had, that people appreciate being outdoors is a good thing, and they want to continue doing it. It's a learned habit that they've got to enjoy in the last year.
Emma, when you talk about people taking a holistic approach to an interior, you also, I think, promote the idea of people taking a holistic approach to the inside and the outside. And there's very much, I've noticed in your projects, there's a sort of seamless join between inside and out. Would you say that's true?
Yes, I would agree with that. I think, I love to think that when you're in the house and you're looking out, that the view that you see has been really well considered. So perhaps if you have a garden table, don't just leave it completely undressed, but actually, put some beautiful plant pots on the table with some topiary balls in them, or some, herbs in baskets. It's the way sort of decorating that you can do cleverly to make a room, like Joanna said, a room of that sort of garden space. One of the great things that have been invented in the more recent times is cordless lights. So being able to take a sort of battery charged light out on and put it on your garden table. I think lighting is a really important thing in our homes, in our gardens as well as our homes. So we need to think about garden lighting. And then the other big thing that's very popular for us at the moment is games rooms for the younger generation and the adults actually, but having these barn spaces that we can convert. It doesn't need to be a big barn, but maybe if you're buying something with an outbuilding, making that into a kind of games room where you can have a kitchen, a little mini kitchen, you can have a pool table, kind of big sofas, and perhaps just use it for a kids den, and get the children out of the house. I think that's, if perhaps the adults are working in the house and then the kids can be outside. I think just defining these spaces and using these outside buildings, really making those outbuildings work for themselves rather than just being kind of garden sheds nowadays. I think that's a good way to look at it when you're looking at beautiful properties with Joanna. How are those outbuildings going to work for me? Quite important.
Joanna, how do you advise clients who are having to make a choice between two polarities, really? One of which is, as you say, a sort of turnkey opportunity, or at the other end, a project. I mean, they're so vastly different. What do you think are the advantages of maybe going the project route?
I think a bit like Emma referred to earlier, I think there's very often value in that. Obviously, you inevitably expect the price to be discounted, and there are indeed quite inflated premiums paid for turnkey opportunities, particularly in the larger country houses, because that's quite rare. Therefore, I tend to say think long, as I said earlier, but also look at the fact that this is probably affording you a house that you might not otherwise have been able to be affording if the work had all been done. And then I think just really arming yourself with a really good team of advice. We've, over the years, built a very good and broad structure of people we can refer to, whether it's architectural designers, interior designers, obviously like Emma, and really just understanding what the control of that looks like, but also look at it as a whole, because sometimes I think there's a tendency to think, oh, I'll get a builder in and he'll tell me what it'll cost, or I'll get an architect in and he'll tell me what it'll cost. I think sometimes just actually taking a little bit of due diligence to inform yourself about the steps you're about to take not only expedites the journey of the work undertaken, but also gives you sometimes the idea of interim goals along the way, rather than always hankering, if you like, for a project to be completed, which may potentially take anything from 1 to 3 years in some of these larger houses. But you might perhaps focus on a lovely outbuilding that might become in time the guest annex. But I've known clients then enjoy those in a very animated fashion while the bigger project is going on, and they can still escape to their house in the country. It just might be the cottage or the ancillary in the initial stages while they play with the bigger project at hand. And then that becomes quite fun, because a lot of the development of these houses around experiencing that space, understanding the light, how are you using it, how are the gardens working for you. And it may well end up that you reorientate some fairly key spaces, as I know Emma's done, taking lovely large drawing rooms and turning them into lovely large kitchens. And it's just sometimes only over time do you achieve that. So I'm a big fan of doing a project if you can, and just taking, as I say, a slightly longer approach to the whole thing, but knowing that when you've done it, it's absolutely bespoke to your family and your life and your needs. And I think therefore will last much, much longer for your own enjoyment.
Thank you. Emma, what advice do you give clients who are thinking about adding a lot more square footage to a property? I mean, they're faced with the choice of working with what they got and reconfiguring, or adding on to that. And obviously, it's a big decision to make.
Yeah, I would always encourage them to talk to an architect and perhaps look at the opportunities that a house might have to extend, and even do some drawings and potentially even do the planning, get the planning application in. I think we work very closely with architects on the space planning and how the house is going to function and flow. And I think, having that sort of collaborative team early on to look at the potential of a house is well worth doing. I think it's money well worth spent on a property at the beginning. I think having a master plan is, for me, it's vital. I would just say, look at the master plan, look at what you can achieve, even if you decide actually to take that approach where you're not spending all your money up front on the building and then you can't afford to furnish it. And I do always encourage our clients to have a budget and to think about that early on, and we can help them with that budget process in terms of what will it cost me to furnish this 8,000 square foot house, and almost from day one we're able to give some guidance on the furnishing and the interiors. And I think that's really helpful for a client, because otherwise they just go into it blind and not understanding, if I do want to create that big extension, how much am I going to have left for the interior decoration. So I think, my advice would always be have the master plan, push yourself, look at the options, and then perhaps take your time, as Joanna said, in doing the additions. Buy a house that you've got opportunities to extend over the years. You don't have to do it all at once. Part of the pleasure, in a way, is growing into your home and knowing that home has got a future, that you can develop, and you can create something more if you want to at a later date.
Architects and interior designers very often come at the subject from rather a different perspective. What's the secret, Emma, do you think, of ensuring you've got a harmonious relationship between architects and interior designers? Because famously they sometimes don't get on. How does one handle that?
I think creating the team is the most important thing that you're going to do if you are going to employ a professional team, architect and designer. Understanding where the responsibilities lie and making sure that the boundaries aren't particularly crossed. So having a clear outline at the beginning. If you're working with an interior designer who is also, as we are at Sims-Hilditch, we are architectural interior designers too, so we can do the interior architectural package. Having that understanding at the beginning of who's doing what the responsibilities are between the architect and the interior designer is vital. And so we have a sort of matrix that we created to basically delineate or define who's doing what, and then the client doesn't end up paying twice as well. So it's really important to have that. I think, just making sure that you choose your designer. I sort of likened it a bit to walking down a shopping street, the King's Road, looking in the shops, and what appeals to one person might not appeal to another. Why does one person go into one dress shop and another walk straight past it? I think we all have different expectations, different creative ideas, and I think making sure your interior designer is aligned with you at the beginning is so important, because it will only serve to do the project justice and to make sure you have a happy working relationship with the team. So that's my advice.
Thank you. And I'm conscious now that we've covered a huge amount of ground. The clock is ticking. So I just want to sort of begin to wind up with a question for both of you. Firstly, to you, Janet. Obviously, people have a huge choice of different investments they can make in a house, and they will inevitably need to prioritize those. What for you is the most valuable investment when someone is creating their dream country home?
I would say, interestingly, and I suppose I'm bound to say this with the lovely Emma on the call, but I think what I very often see is a huge amount of money is spent in the construction or the design of a house, and then the value added for the content seems to get lost along the way. Now, that's sometimes budget, as Emma was saying, but it's such a key component. I mean, to the point where we do very often offer professional home staging actual guidance to clients when they come to sell. So I think obviously for the forever house, you're less imagining what that might look and feel like if you think you'll never sell it. But I would always say, do always think about the interiors, because it is extraordinary how compelling people find good interiors matter to their response to what they'll pay for it. And we as agents, time and time again, I mean, we, I'm afraid, use the euphemism every time, if they just used a bit of Farrow and Ball. You know, it is because there's a subtle palette to those frameworks of those sorts of paints. And I think it just comes with the interior of an older country house, that it's sympathetic to it. Very often people's own choices are quite dramatic, and those are harder to sell if they're more extreme. So I think investment wise, I'd always say really, really think about investing in proper interior advice. And that's both the colours and the papers you might put on the walls, right down to some of the key pieces of artwork, and critically lighting. Because ultimately, it makes the space more valuable for you to use, but also it means that should and when you ever decide to move on from that house, that's already been future-proofed into it, to frankly enhance its saleability.
Emma, what about you?
It's such a big question and such a hard one to answer in one point, Giles. But I think Joanna has probably said what I would say. I think, you know, the interior design of a house is so vital to get it a big house. If you're working on something, you know, you would never expect you would never expect to go and do your own perform your own legal functions if you had you know, something to do with the law. You would never expect to take your own teeth out. You need to have professional people when you're dealing with a big project, and getting your team right, and then making sure that you have thought about everything is vital. And so that interior architectural phase for me is probably, although I personally adore doing the soft furnishings, the decoration side, in the studio we focus very heavily first on the interior architecture. So that space planning, that joinery design, lighting design, bathroom design, and then the hard finishes, the stone, the timber. Those are the things that you can only do once. You only want to do them once. They're going to cost money. You know, choosing that timber and choosing that stone, once they're down, they're down. And I think that's where a professional can really help you, guide you through the total minefield of what's out there, and the choice is just so endless. So don't be afraid to. In America, they totally and utterly embrace interior designers. Everybody who can afford one uses one, and they're very proud of using them. I think in the UK, we're a little bit more reserved.
Thank you. And thank you very much to both of you for coming along to share your infinite wisdom. You are, both in your respective fields, the calm voice of experience. And I know that people will have found it incredibly helpful listening to what you have to say on this subject. And I'd finally like to finish by thanking Hamptons for hosting this opportunity to come along and get some inspiration for wherever it is that you eventually end up. And I hope that that's going to be a very exciting opportunity for you all. Thanks for joining us today. Goodbye.